So my name is Philip Ramu. I'm a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Maine, New York. I have been involved with death and dying for most of my career. I spent the first part of my career extensively in New York City dealing with the HIV/AIDS crisis. And then after that, I had my own experiences with loss. The head knowledge is always so complemented by life experience, because until you experience loss, theories don't really work or help as much. So, and specifically, as a result of that life experience working with death and dying, I experienced many traditions, helping people from Christian backgrounds, Hindu backgrounds, Buddhist, Native American. It was a unbelievable experience in my career to be able to work with people with so many different backgrounds and how they dealt with death and dying and grief and mourning. And I have to say, not in an arrogant way or in a overly proud way, as a member of Israel and Jewish, I think our tradition is really right at the top as far as the process that a participant of Israel goes through in dealing and coping with death and dying. And a lot of people know the traditional Shiva period, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, the 7 days of mourning. But the process of death and dying in the Jewish tradition, which is what Bob asked me to focus on, is really a correlation to our meditation practice, because the meditation practice deals with the quieting and the no-mind experience and going into the self and touching the eternity, touching the divine consciousness, going to the no mind. And this is the place where the soul is refreshed and most comfortable. The life experience in our waking state, in our conscious state, is really foreign to the soul. And that's why life is a journey that we learn and go through. And learning to quiet ourselves, learning to bring ourselves to a place of silence, as we do when we go to sleep, but we're not aware. So we do when we meditate. We train and experience no mind. We train and experience the soul to be comfortable in this place of eternity. So the Jewish experience, when one becomes aware of a death, is different from I'll compare it to the Christian tradition. In the Christian tradition, when someone dies and the message goes out, the person will be usually in a funeral parlor, and there'll be 2-3 days, sometimes a week before that happens. Family will come, people will come. There'll be lots of trying to comfort the grief of the family of the person, the loss, whoever, a husband, wife, children. And it's right up front in the front end. In the Jewish tradition, comforting and grieving the onan, the person who's the griever, which in Jewish tradition traditionally would be father, husband, wife, father, mother, and sibling. And that is considered the aninut period, when you hear of this death and you enter into pre-burial, this period of time up to burial. You are what we call an onan, someone who's in grief. And from that, you have responsibilities of things you can do and things you cannot do. And again, I'm talking from the more traditional perspective. If you go into different Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, a lot of this is the same, but much of it has been modified. I'm giving you the general universal position that most people practice. So the onan is very aware that a grief has happened, a death, a loss. And the first thing is you don't comfort them before the burial. You don't try to shorten the grief before the person's in the ground. Why? Because in the Jewish tradition, which is really rooted in the mystical, the soul is attached to the body, and as it gradually starts to leave at the time of death, immediately, there is an awareness that life goes on after. Whether you believe in life after death in terms of eternity and waiting for resurrection, or whether you believe in reincarnation, which is very much a part of the Jewish tradition, even though a lot of people don't know that. It is a big part of the Jewish tradition, life to life, soul to soul. The journey starts with the recognition, the griever, the onan, does something called kriya, what is a ripping, a tearing of garment, showing that I am going to begin, and that really symbolizes I'm going to begin a physical separation from my loved one. So I physically do something, and everything in the Jewish world is always about spiritual, physical. You never just contemplate. You always do a physical, spiritual act. That's what a mitzvah is. It's a joining of the physical and spiritual world in the world of action. Hence, in death, our practices are very physical, very visible, but very spiritual. Because what we're acknowledging through the separation of the physical, the soul from the body, the person observing the loss of their partner, their child, their grief is right there. It begins with the kriya, sometimes very often a shout, a cry, and then the process is to get the person buried as soon as possible. And we follow what's called the dust to dust. So we don't, usually the body is looked at in a very spiritual way. It's very, very special. So it's protected by a shomer, a guard. It goes to a funeral home or someone's home in a special place. And the second stage is what's called the tahara, where the body is prepared for burial, where it's washed in a very specific way. Much too detailed to go into in the time frame I have, but it's recognizing that this body that has held this life energy in it is holy, and therefore it must return to its origin as quickly as possible in the same way that the soul is returning to its origin and ascending, which is a process that takes it doesn't happen immediately usually, except in special circumstances. It's a process that can take up to 30 days. Some people say 45 days, and some people say even up to a year for that soul to complete its journey after it's left the body. How do we know all of this? It's basically been written in traditional literature, in mystical sources, and a lot of it's been homespun, word of mouth, passed down from generation to generation. Did this knowledge start with Avram Avinu? Did it start with Moshe? Did it start with pre-Abraham, even with Noah? We don't know the origin, but we know that these practices, traditions go back to at least the time of Abraham, because even in the Bible, the first thing he does is find a place for his wife to be taken immediately in Hebron and then buried in the cave of Machpelah. So the tradition has been there, and it's been modeled throughout history that Jews bury within 24 to 48 hours. Some days today in modern times, some people extend it to 72, but that's really for a very unusual circumstance. And the other thing is that when Israel, for example, in the land of Israel, they don't use coffins. They just put you in a white shroud and put you directly into a pre-dug hole, usually for the whole family. They'll have their graves, and you won't use a coffin. In America and other places, they'll use a simple wooden box that breaks down and deteriorates, but usually a pine, with no fancy adornments, just usually a Magen David, a shield of David on the box. And the male will be wrapped in his prayer shawl as well as the white shroud, and maybe some special symbolic part of his life will be put into the box or with the shroud. And this starts that period of real intense mourning, because now the person's in the ground. And at the grave, people say prayers, or when they hear prayers to help the grief. The first major prayer that's said, even by the person who's dying before their death, and the family and people and friends after, is the Shema Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, which is what Bob did a whole lesson on for us about this reason this prayer is so important, because it's about the unification of consciousness and the divine consciousness. And so the last words on the lips of the Jew is the Shema, to return to the oneness, which I think is an amazing thing. And the other thing that's really important is the prayer that says, we say, blessed art thou, Lord, O God, King of the universe, who is the true judge. Dayen ha-emet, the true judge. This is what you say when you hear of a death of a loved one in Israel. because what it's telling to the consciousness of the person who's hearing the news and the consciousness of those who've died is that life continues and it's in God's hands. And it's really about teaching us that we're not really in control. For some of us, being in control is very important. And at this time of loss, if there's one thing anyone who knows about death and dying and grief and loss is, you want to stop it. You want the person back. You want to hold on. You don't want to let go. You want to control. So this blessing of blessed art thou, Lord our God, King of the universe, the true judge, is to help you recognize that this was God's decision. It may not have been our timing. It may not be what we want, but it was a decision made in a much higher place, and we should flow with that and do everything we can to flow with that. To help the Onan flow with that, immediately after the funeral, cemetery, washing of hands, make a separation between the death experience, and you go to the house of mourning, which is a combination of two things. Anybody who's ever been to a Shiva period place in someone's house, 7 days, is you notice that there are little benches. Because we don't, the people who sit on those little benches are the immediate family, because they are not returning to life as it was, normal life. They're returning to the realization that life is uncomfortable and a loss has happened and someone has moved on, and I am going to do something physical to show that things are not regular. The other thing that happens in the Shiva house, which is very common, is there's lots of food. And isn't that always amazing? Especially Jewish people love food. In life, we love food through our death experiences. Why food? Sometimes people get carried away and the community will send food, enough food to last a week, a month, so that the people who are going through this grief don't have to worry about food. But yet they need to eat and they need to be sustained. But what's the message that food gives? Life continues. So immediately after when you go to the house in the morning from the cemetery, you come into a house where there's all kinds of food laid out. Somebody has to set that up, and there's a community responsible group who sets that up called the Chevra Kadisha. They help do a lot of these things in many religious communities, but sometimes it's just families and friends of communities of people who are maybe not religious, but socially very aware of their responsibilities, who will set up the food and set up a food schedule and do all kinds of things to make sure that the grieving family members, the Onanim, are aware that they don't have to worry about getting food, and they can receive anyone who wants to come and pay their respects. The second thing that's present in the house of mourning and for the 7 days of Shiva is prayers. And the main prayer that is said, which starts at the cemetery, which is said for a full year, in many cases for the loss of a parent, and even it can be for us partners as well, is the Kaddish. And Kaddish is Yitgadal v'Yitgadash. This is an Aramaic prayer. It's not even Hebrew. It's a very old Aramaic prayer that extols and praises the name of God. There's no mention in that prayer about death and dying. There's no mention in that prayer about anything about actually what's happening in the day. And yet it has become the prima facie prayer in Israel to help us deal with death and dying. Now, there are many forms of Kaddishim prayers, Kaddish prayers. There's a specific one for this experience that happens at the cemetery that I'm not going to get into the language, but the words address the death of the loved one, and the words before and after the prayer of saying the Kaddish is said for the loved one. But the congregation also joins into this Kaddish prayer, and in some ancient traditions, it's even sung at the gravesite or sung in the memorial in beautiful 5-part harmony called the Great Kaddish. It's a beautiful song. And then there are throughout in this house of mourning, one of the requirements is to get a minyan, a group of 10 people, Jewish people together, so you could say the Kaddish and say the prayers and the blessings. And this usually happens in the morning prayers in the house of the mourner. So from there, you move after the Shiva period, 30 days, and then there's a memorial service sometimes set up. After 30 days, you can do memorial. Why would you do memorial after 30 days? Because Jews bury so fast. A lot of people are in other parts of the world or other states or other places. They can't connect, yet they're connected. So by having the memorial service, this Zikaron, you can allow those people to plan to come. Of course, today with Zoom, a lot of this past couple of years, we've had a lot of funerals and house of mournings and memorial services attended by Zoom. Technology has made this a very, very interesting connector, which I think is a wonderful thing. I participated in Israel when I was here. Someone had died and was buried in Israel, and I participated in the whole thing through Zoom, and it was a fascinating experience. And I think we're blessed by this form of use of technology. There are many other forms that we're not blessed by, but I won't get into that. That's for another lesson. So and then after the 30 days, there's an understanding that the soul is on its journey. So some of the things you do within the week of Shiva, which I did mention, some of the traditions are to cover a mirror, different reasons. Some is so that you don't have to worry about how you look. You know, males won't put a razor to their face, so their beard and they're disheveled. So you cover the mirror so you don't have to see yourself. Other reasons for covering the mirror, more mystical, spiritual, is that the soul very often hangs around, comes to visit the loved ones, and sometimes through some kind of mystical mystery, mirrors can reflect the presence of the soul. You might even see your loved one in the soul in the mirror. So they'll cover the mirror because you don't want them to see you crying and being sad, because then they're not going to want to leave, which is going to prevent their journey. And they need to know that you're okay. So other thing we do is we open a window to allow the soul to move out of the house of mourning, to not stick around. We give it permission. We never talk to the dead, which is a violation of the Torah commandment, but we have an understanding and an awareness and acceptance that this soul is seeing our thoughts and hearing our words and experiencing us, which is a really, really coping, amazing thing, because sometimes people die, you don't get to say goodbye, or you don't get to say, I'm sorry. But in the Jewish tradition, we have an understanding that they can still hear and see and know, and they've got this time while their soul is moving, and they've gone into another dimension, but they're kind of in two worlds. So we can talk to them and say, hey, I'm so sorry, I never paid you back that $10. Oh, I'm sorry, I never gave you, the permission you wanted to do this task. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just going to miss you, but it's okay. Do your journey. It's okay. And they hear it, and that helps them move on. And everybody says, move up. Well, I don't really believe it's up. I don't believe you're going up into the heavens. I believe you're going interdimensionally into places that our intellects don't really fully understand, but into the multiverse. Not the one you get through technology, but the one you get through soul to soul experience. And even through meditation, sometimes we touch that multiverse where people have experienced their past lives through meditation and recognize and understand some of what I'm talking about. Some of you may have had these experiences. Let's see. So then 30 days, and then there is essentially something called the unveiling. At this memorial, very often, once the stone is established on the gravesite, there'll be a special memorial service, which is also called an unveiling, when you take off the cover for the names on the stone, and this would satisfy, allow the mourner to move to the next level. And people will come to the cemetery, not a lot usually, but people will come to the cemetery to participate in in the unveiling. Very few prayers are said, one or two, or maybe a blessing, and a lot of sometimes people just spontaneously might tell a story about the loved one, because there's a sharing that this person had a life, and that life was hopefully successful, and hopefully through their death, they're even affecting those who are alive and hearing the memorial of their story. It's very, very powerful. And then up to a year, you do these memorials, and you like at the three major holidays, Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, and also on High Holy Days, Yom Kippur, they'll light a candle called a Yahrzeit candle, a Yizkor candle. And there's something, Yizkor is a reminder. You'll honor and remember your loved one. And you can do that every year until you die. There's no limit on it. I'm trying to think of what else I might be missing. Essentially, there is several prayers that are said from, and one of them I wanted to read if we could find it. It's may his or her soul be bound up in the bonds of eternal life. So it's very interesting because in Hebrew, it says Tehiyeh Nishmato Surah Besur HaChaim. So you lose it in the English translation, but Sur HaChaim is literally the stone or the rock of life. So it really should say, may his or her soul be connected or bound in the rock of eternal life, the stone of eternal life, which is a reflection on a blessing that Yaakov gave to Yosef. It's understanding that the stone of Israel runs throughout history, and it binds and connects all of us in Israel. And those who are connected to the stone of Israel, to the stone, the rock, we call it the Rock of Ages. It's, a lot of Christian songs, Rock of Ages, cleft for me, right? In Israel, this sur, this rock, this stone, is a binding energy between heaven and earth that connects us not only above spiritually, but physically connects us. And right to the center of Jerusalem at Har Moriah is the stone called the Eben Shatia, stone of foundation. And that stone binds us. And so right in the very prayers built into our faith is this beautiful prayer that this soul may be bound. In Hebrew, the word bound is like a connection that doesn't get ever broken. Very, very special word. Literature, I think the best book ever written on this that I've ever read, and it's just my opinion, is The Jewish Way in Death and Mourning by Maurice Lamb, L-A-M-M, Maurice Lamb. And a brilliant scholar, Maurice Lamb. He came from a family of brothers, Orthodox rabbis. I knew his brother very well at Sherath Israel in Manhattan. They all have a beautiful way of writing and taking difficult topics and making them palpable. And this book, The Jewish Way in Death and Mourning, will go over in much more detail all the halakha, the rules, the regulations, but also the meaning behind that. These are not meaningless acts, but each act is a holy, special mitzvah. That's it.
Thank you so much, Philip. That was beautiful.
You're welcome.
Very,
thank you for the opportunity.
Emotional. And it just makes my heart feel like these changes, these big changes, are expansion of consciousness and crossing the border into higher consciousness. And these beautiful customs help us do that, help the individual soul that's moving on, as well as the souls of the family that are missing that incarnation now of that particular soul. And next week, I'll talk a little bit about, from the Vedic tradition, some of the customs that help that and some of the ideas that are passed down through that tradition.